They told me my dead wife's spirit was furious at me. I told them if she had something to say, she knew where to find me. The whisper came in the dead of night, soft, haunting, and far too familiar. My heart stopped. Alex. I froze, breath catching in my throat. It was her voice, Sarah's, my late wife, the woman I couldn't seem to let go of, even though she'd been gone for months. The photo of her on the mantel, the letters she wrote me, they still haunted every corner of this house. I couldn't move on, not yet. But this wasn't set a comforting voice. It was the kind of voice that made your skin crawl, a whisper that didn't set feel like a message from the beyond. It felt like a warning, and in the back of my mind a dreadful thought crept forward. This was no ghost. This was Anne. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. My daughter-in-law had been acting strange, pushing boundaries, making me doubt my own decisions. But now, this was different. She wasn't just playing with my grief, she was trying to manipulate it. The whispers grew louder, coming late at night, always when I was alone. It was never Sarah's spirit reaching out to me. It was Anne's voice, disguised, hiding behind the veil of superstition, claiming that Sarah's spirit was angry with me, claiming the will I'd made would tear us apart. The will, everything I had worked for, my home, my workshop, my legacy, was on the line. Anne had her eyes on it all. She didn't care about my grief. She cared about what I could give her. That night, as I stood in the kitchen, I realized the truth. Anne wasn't just grieving, she was plotting. This wasn't a haunting, this was a con, and I was done being her pawn. I was going to expose her lies. Every whisper, every fake receipt, every forged document she thought would manipulate me. I would turn it against her. The house felt colder, the shadows longer, but I wasn't afraid anymore. This was the beginning, my fight for everything I'd ever worked for. Anne had made a fatal mistake. She underestimated me. I wouldn't let her take anything from me. This time the truth was on my side. The days that followed felt like a strange blur. The whispers didn't stop. Each night, as the clock struck midnight, the house would fall into that same eerie stillness, and that's when it would start, the voice. It wasn't just in the kitchen anymore. It was in the hallway, in the living room, in the corners of the house. I hadn't visited in months, and every time I heard it, it took me longer to shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was real. But it wasn't Tente. I kept telling myself that, over and over again. It was just grief playing tricks on my mind. But the whispers kept getting louder, more insistent, and more specific. They weren't just murmurs in the dark anymore. They were sentences, demands. Alex, fix the will. Undo what you has begun. My heart would race, my hands shaking. I could feel Sarah's presence, her memory pressing down on me. But there was something off, something unnatural. The voice wasn't just Sarah's. It was too familiar, too soft, too much like Anne's voice, creeping under the cover of night. I spent days questioning myself. Is this really happening? Was I hearing things? Was I losing my mind? Or was it all part of Anne's scheme to get what she wanted? The bills had started piling up, strange ones. Small, unimportant amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there. I ignored them at first. After all, I was still adjusting to the idea of being alone in the house that Sarah and I had once built together. But then they got bigger. They started to show up with items I didn't recognize. Even more suspiciously, the handwriting was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that Anne was behind this. She'd been leaving me notes, small slips of paper hidden under books, or slipped between the pages of my old journals. The spirit demands you change the will, one of them read. The more I read, the more I realize this wasn't just about the will. No, Anne wanted something more. She was trying to make me doubt myself, to make me question my own sanity, and she was using Sarah's memory, my grief, against me. One evening, after another restless night, I found another note on the kitchen counter. This one was different. It wasn't signed, but it was clear as day. The spirit is angry. Change it, or there will be consequences. I felt the cold knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the house. It was everything. My legacy, my memories of Sarah, the life we built. Anne wanted to destroy it all, and she was using every dirty trick in the book to get it. That was the moment I knew for sure. I wasn't going to sit back and let her manipulate me any longer. The next day, I took a walk through my workshop. The familiar smell of oil and metal filled the air. It was the only place in the house where I felt a sense of peace, where I wasn't haunted by whispers or shadows. As I walked around, I couldn't help but think of how many years I had spent building this place from the ground up. How many hours I'd spent welding, grinding, and perfecting the cars that came through my doors. This workshop wasn't just a business, it was a piece of my soul. I couldn't let Anne take it from me. Not this time. I started collecting the evidence. Every bill, every strange note, every item that didn't belong. The things she thought I wouldn't notice. The things that would be my proof. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I wasn't just a victim of my emotions. I was fighting back. The next step was clear. I needed to gather everything I could. I wasn't going to let Anne think she could get away with this. My lawyer had warned me about her tactics before. Superstition hides greed better than shadows, he'd said, his voice low and serious. I hadn't understood it fully then, but now I did. The truth would always come out, and when it did, Anne would regret underestimating me. The whispers had become a constant. At first I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that grief was playing tricks on me, but as the days went by, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The voice, soft and insistent, seemed to follow me everywhere. It wasn't Sarah's voice anymore. It was Anne's, manipulative, demanding, using the memory of my wife as a pawn in her game. And it wasn't just the whispers. The bills had started showing up, small amounts at first, things I could explain away. A grocery bill for $45, a late fee for $32. But then I noticed something odd, something that couldn't be explained away. One bill was for a $200 charge at a spa. Another was a $450 withdrawal from an account I didn't recognize. The handwriting was strange, too neat, too deliberate. It wasn't my handwriting. It wasn't even Sarah's. I had always been meticulous about my finances. Every bill was filed, every receipt logged, but these felt like they were trying to push me into something I wasn't ready for, something I didn't want. I had to know what was going on. I started keeping track, marking every bill, every charge. They didn't stop. They kept coming. Always in small increments, always something that seemed insignificant at first glance. But the more I looked at them, the more it became clear. Anne was behind this. She was trying to make me doubt myself, make me question my own sanity. I could feel the weight of it growing heavier every day. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills in front of me. The numbers blurred together, but one name stood out. Anne Sitz. Her name was scribbled on the back of a receipt. "The spirit demands you fix the will," it read in her handwriting. I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't some tragic misunderstanding. Anne had been forging documents, planting false bills, using them to manipulate me into changing my will. The evidence was all around me, but I still didn't know how to prove it. The next day, I went to the local bank, trying to get a clearer picture of the transactions. I had a feeling that the charges weren't just random, they were part of something bigger. I needed to know what she had done. When the bank manager handed me a copy of the recent statements, my heart sank. There it was, a series of transactions that led to an account I didn't recognize. Anne's name wasn't on it, but it was clear she had been involved. I couldn't sit back any longer. I needed to act. I couldn't let her get away with this. I contacted my lawyer, scheduling a meeting for the following day. I needed him to look over everything, the bills, the strange transactions, the receipts. I couldn't do this alone anymore. I had to expose Anne for who she truly was. And so, I began my search for the truth. I gathered everything I could, every bill, every receipt, every piece of paper that might help me find the evidence I needed. Anne thought she could manipulate me. She thought I was too broken, too grief-stricken to see the truth. But she was wrong. This was my legacy. My home, my workshop, and I was going to protect it, no matter what. That night, I took all the documents I had collected and locked them in my filing cabinet. I wasn't taking any chances. Anne was getting desperate, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she'd try something else. The next step was clear. I had to find proof that would end this once and for all. And when I did, I'd make sure the entire family knew the truth. Anne's lies were going to be exposed, and there would be no way out for her. I had never been more determined in my life. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together, but I still needed more. The bills, the forged receipts, the strange transactions. All of it pointed to one thing: Anne was behind this, pulling the strings from the shadows, but I couldn't just confront her without the right evidence. The night I realized how deep her scheme ran, I was alone in the workshop. The scent of oil and metal, the hum of the lights above, they always calmed me, grounding me in a way nothing else could. It had been my sanctuary for as long as I could remember. It was where Sarah and I had spent countless hours, building something we could be proud of. Now it was the only place where I could think clearly, away from the whispers that had invaded every other corner of my life. The garage door slid open, the air crisp with the cold, and I stepped into the familiar space. But tonight, it wasn't the workshop that was on my mind. It was the wrench in my hand. I gripped it tightly, the weight of it reminding me of everything I stood to lose. My legacy, my work, my home, everything was slipping away, and I couldn't let that happen. Not because of Anne. Not because she wanted to take everything from me. I sat at the cluttered workbench, the tools around me like old friends. I'd spent years building this place, shaping it with my own hands, just as I had built the life Sarah and I had together. But as the wrench sat in my palm, I realized that the life I had built was under attack, and I had to protect it, even if it meant destroying the person who was trying to take it from me. The first piece of real evidence came when I was rifling through the pile of receipts and papers Anne had left scattered around. One stood out, a receipt for a wire transfer of $1,200 paid to an unlisted account with an unfamiliar name. I stared at it for a moment, the truth sinking in. It was an odd amount, too precise to be anything but deliberate. Anne had been using her access to my accounts to siphon money out, little by little, under the guise of these ghostly demands. The spirit didn't want me to have anything left. She was using that as her excuse. But it wasn't a spirit. It was greed, pure and simple. The more I dug through the documents, the more I found: a forged receipt for a donation to a charity she knew I would never support, an inflated medical bill I was supposed to have paid for Sarah's final expenses, even though I knew I had taken care of everything. Anne was hiding behind the veil of manipulation, hoping I wouldn't notice the subtle inconsistencies. She had to think I was stupid. I was no fool. I spent hours that night going through every single paper, every transaction, every small detail she had left behind. I wasn't going to let this go unnoticed. It was clear now Anne had been using my grief to control me. She'd planted the seeds of doubt, manipulated my emotions, and now she was trying to erase my legacy. I had no choice but to expose her. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. This wasn't just about a will anymore. This was about something far more important. This was about justice. It wasn't just her betrayal. It was everything she was willing to destroy to get what she wanted. As I sorted through the last of the papers, I came across the original draft of the will, the one that had triggered all of this in the first place. It was neatly folded, tucked away in the back of the drawer, buried beneath all the false receipts and the forged letters. I hadn't looked at it in months, but tonight it seemed like the most important thing in the world. I took it in my hands and read through the clauses again, each one carefully outlined. It wasn't much, just a few changes to the distribution of my assets. Nothing that would affect the core of my legacy. But it was enough. It was enough for Anne to set her plan in motion. My heart was racing as I looked over the will again. One last time. Anne thought she could take everything from me. She thought she could manipulate my grief into making me change it. But now, with the evidence I had the power. I wasn't going to let her win. I reached for my phone and dialed the number I had been avoiding. My lawyer, it was time to bring him in. "We need to move forward," I said, my voice steady, but my anger simmering just beneath the surface. "Get ready. This is going to be bigger than we thought." I hung up, then sat back in my chair, staring at the wrench in my hand. This wasn't just about a betrayal anymore. This was about the fight for my entire life, and I wasn't going to lose, not to her. Thanksgiving was just days away, but it felt like the tension had been building for months. Anne had been insistent on holding a family séance for weeks now, claiming it was the only way to calm Sarah's spirit. The idea was absurd, but the more she pushed, the more I realized something. It wasn't just about honoring Sarah, it was about getting me to feel guilty, to doubt myself, to second-guess my decisions. She'd been careful, calculating every word, every gesture, playing the role of the grieving daughter-in-law who just wanted peace. But it was clear as day now she wasn't interested in peace. She was interested in control, and she was going to use Thanksgiving, the family's biggest holiday, to get what she wanted. It wasn't just about the will anymore. It wasn't even about the house, the workshop, or the money. It was about something deeper, something more personal. Anne's insatiable need to control what belonged to Sarah and me. I could already feel the pressure mounting. My daughter Claire had been skeptical about the seance from the start. She didn't buy into the idea of spirits or ghosts, and she definitely didn't trust Anne. "Dad, don't let her pull you into this," she had warned. "She's just trying to manipulate you. You know that, right?" I had nodded, but in the back of my mind I wondered if I was just being paranoid. Was I reading too much into all of this? Or was Anne truly as dangerous as I feared? By the time Thanksgiving Day arrived, my nerves were shot. The family was gathering at the house, and I could feel the tension in the air. The dining room was already set, the candles flickering as the table was filled with food. But for me it felt like a stage for Anne's little performance. I could almost hear her rehearsing her lines in the other room. The spirit was angry, the will had to be changed, and if I didn't listen there would be consequences. She had already laid the groundwork. She had made sure everyone was convinced, and when she pulled out the so-called spiritual advisor, I could already see the game she was playing. The only thing she didn't know was that I had already outplayed her. For weeks, I had been gathering everything, every receipt, every forged bill, every strange transaction, every document I could find, and I'd hired a private investigator to follow her. The PI had been working quietly behind the scenes, capturing every interaction, every word, and now I had what I needed. Evidence, concrete evidence of her manipulation. The night before Thanksgiving, I went over the tapes. The private investigator had captured Anne meeting with my brother-in-law in a parking lot. They were talking in hushed voices, but it was clear what they were plotting. "We need to push him harder," Anne had said. "If he doesn't set change the will, he's set'll lose everything. The spirit one set forgive him." I listened to it over and over, my anger rising with every word. Anne was playing a dangerous game, but this time I wasn't going to let her win. This time I had the upper hand. As I tucked the tape into my coat pocket, I felt a calmness settle over me. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. The next day, as the family gathered around the dinner table, I knew the confrontation was inevitable. Anne would try to pull the same stunt again, playing the grieving daughter-in-law, claiming that Sarah's spirit had rejected the will. She would try to make me look like a fool in front of everyone. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me or my family any longer. As the meal began, Anne spoke up. "I think it's time for the séance," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We need to make sure Sarah Sip's spirit is at peace before we go any further." The family exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of how to react. But I wasn't unsure. I was done playing her game. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and reached into my coat pocket. "Before we continue, I think there's something we need to hear," I said, my voice steady. I clicked the recorder on. The room fell silent as the recording played, Anne Sepp's voice echoing through the speakers. "We need to push him harder. If he doesn't Sepp change the will, he Seps lose everything. The spirit one Seps forgive him." Annasta's face turned ashen, her eyes widening in disbelief. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. My son, Dan, was the first to react. "What is this? What the hell is going on?" He turned to Anne, his voice shaking with anger. "How could you do this?" Anne's carefully crafted facade began to crack. She stammered, but the damage was done. The truth had come out. The room was filled with a heavy silence. the weight of the revelation sinking in. Anne had been manipulating all of us, using superstition and grief to get what she wanted. I think it's time for you to leave, I said quietly, my gaze never leaving Anne's. Her face flushed with rage, but she knew she had no ground to stand on. She stood up, gathering her things, but not before casting one last look at me. This isn't over, she spat, her voice low and dangerous. Actually, I said, as she made her way toward the door, I think it is. The family stared at me, their faces a mix of shock, relief, and confusion. But I wasn't concerned about their reactions. I was concerned about one thing: I had finally taken control. Anne's manipulation had been exposed for all to see, and I was done letting her pull the strings. As the door slammed behind her, I felt the weight of the past few months lift off my shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but I had won the first round, and that in itself was a victory. The night before Thanksgiving, I sat in my office, staring at the drawer in front of me. It wasn't a large drawer, but it felt like it was holding everything, every lie Anne had fed me, every manipulation she'd carefully constructed. I hadn't intended to keep the tape hidden for this long, but after everything I'd uncovered, it was clear. The time to confront Anne was finally here. The tape recorder sat on the desk, its button ready to play. I had listened to it countless times already, the way Anne had spoken so confidently with my brother-in-law about pushing me, about the will, about how the spirit would demand my compliance. But each time I heard it, it felt more powerful. It felt like the key to everything I needed to expose her. But the real victory wasn't just in the tape itself. It was in the fact that I had outsmarted her. Anne thought she could control the narrative. She thought she had me in a corner, emotionally vulnerable and overwhelmed by grief. She was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the Thanksgiving dinner the next day. She was planning to make her move. The seance, the so-called spiritual advisor, she would use all of it to manipulate me in front of the family, to make me seem like a fool, to make me second-guess everything I had fought for, everything I had worked to protect. But I had one advantage she hadn't counted on: my daughter Claire. Claire had always been the sharp one, the logical one. While the rest of the family hovered between disbelief and suspicion, Claire had seen through Anne from the start. Dad, I don't trust her. Shep told me a week before. Shep's playing us, and you know it. I hadn't listened at first. I wanted to believe the best in everyone. I wanted to think that, despite Anne's increasingly erratic behavior, maybe I was just being paranoid. But Claire had been right. Anne's manipulation was too clear now. I took the tape, holding it in my hand, and locked the drawer. I wasn't going to take any chances. Not anymore. I walked to the living room where Claire was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when she saw me enter. Got the evidence, I said quietly, holding up the tape. Her eyes brightened for a moment, but then she gave me a worried look. You sure about this, Dad? Once you play that, there's no going back. I'm sure, I said, my voice steady. She can just get away with this anymore. I been done letting her use me. Claire nodded, her face filled with a mixture of pride and concern. You don't need to prove anything to her. You already done more than enough. But if this is what it takes, then I none with you. I felt a surge of gratitude for my daughter. She wasn't just my ally. She was the one who had kept me grounded through this whole ordeal. While Anne had been trying to manipulate me, Claire had been my anchor, reminding me of what truly mattered. The next morning, the air was heavy with tension. Thanksgiving Day had arrived, and I could feel it in my bones. Anne had been planning this moment for weeks, but so had I. We all gathered around the table, the food steaming, the glasses filled with wine, but the atmosphere felt far from festive. Anne sat at the far end, a carefully cultivated smile plastered on her face as she talked to my brother-in-law, Tom. I watched her for a moment, trying to gauge her next move, but she was too busy putting on the act. So Anne said, her voice almost too sweet, I think it's time for the seance. We need to calm the spirit, make sure everything's right with the world again. I could feel the tension in the room. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her chair, and I knew she was watching Anne closely. The moment was coming. I stood up, the sound of my chair scraping across the floor cutting through the conversation. Everyone fell silent as I pulled out the tape recorder from my coat pocket and set it on the table in front of Anne. "What is that?" Anne asked, her smile faltering slightly. "It sips the truth," I said, my voice firm. "I think it sips time we all heard it." I pressed play. The recorder crackled to life, and Anne Sepp's voice filled the room. "We need to push him harder. If he doesn't Sepp change the will, he Sepps'll lose everything. The spirit one Seps forgive him." Anne's face went pale. Her eyes darted around the room trying to find an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The truth was out. Claire, sitting beside me, watched the family Sip's reactions with a sharp gaze. My son Dan was the first to speak, his voice trembling with disbelief. "How could you?" Anne opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was caught. The family stared at her, the realization slowly sinking in. "What's Sep's going on?" Tom finally asked, his tone darkening as he turned to Anne. "This is all a game to you, isn't it?" Anne stammered, but I could see the panic in her eyes. She was cornered, and for once I had control. I turned to the family, my voice steady. "This is how far she Sit's gone, trying to manipulate me, trying to use my wife Sit's memory to steal everything from me. I wouldn't Sit stand for it anymore." Anne tried to get up, but I held my ground. "It sets over," I said quietly. "You set you're done." Anne's gaze flickered from me to the family, her lips trembling, but no one stood by her. With the tape as evidence, I had finally exposed her for the fraud she was. She couldn't hide anymore. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. The Thanksgiving dinner was a far cry from the warm gathering I had imagined just weeks ago. The table was set with all the traditional fixings: turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, the kind of meal that should have felt like comfort. But there was no comfort here, not anymore. Every dish, every glass of wine seemed to weigh more heavily than the last. Anne sat at the far end of the table, pretending like everything was normal, but I could see it in her eyes. The crack in her carefully constructed facade was visible to everyone now. She had been exposed, but she wasn't going to make it easy. No, she would try to weasel out of it, make excuses, deny it all. But I wasn't going to let her. "Not this time." Claire, sitting next to me, kept her eyes on Anne, her expression steely, her jaw clenched. She had been right all along. Anne had been using me, using my grief, my attachment to Sarah's memory, to get everything she wanted. The will, the house, the workshop. It was all part of her plan, and it had taken this long for me to see it. But now the truth was out, and I wasn't about to let it slip away. I took a deep breath as I stared at Anne, who was still trying to hold her composure. She smiled weakly, but it was clear she knew she was done. "All right, everyone," Anne said, her voice shaking slightly. "I think it's time for the séance, don't you think?" She forced a laugh, but it didn't sound genuine. Her eyes darted nervously to my son Dan, who was still processing everything. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor as I did. The sudden movement grabbed everyone's attention. Silence filled the room as I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the tape recorder. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife, "I think there's something we need to hear before we continue." The room fell utterly still. The sound of my voice seemed to echo in the stillness of the house. I placed the tape recorder on the table, right in front of Anne, and pressed play. The first crackle of the tape was met with confusion. But when Anne's voice came through, clear and unmistakable, the shock hit the room like a tidal wave. "We need to push him harder. If he doesn't change the will, he said'll lose everything. The spirit one forgive him." Anne's face drained of color. Her eyes darted around the room, her lips parted in shock. She wasn't prepared for this. She had no idea I had gotten my hands on the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. No one spoke, no one moved. Then Dan, my son, finally broke the silence. His voice trembled with disbelief. "How could you, Mom? How could you do this to him? To us?" Anne opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Her lips quivered, her eyes flickered to me, then back to Dan and back to the rest of the family. But there was no escape. The truth was undeniable. She stammered, but her voice was weak. This isn't set what you think. Oh, I think it's exactly what we think, I said, my voice low but steady. You thought you could manipulate me into changing my will. You thought you could use Sarah's memory to control me, make me doubt myself. You used superstition to prey on my grief. You used the spirit of my dead wife as a tool to take everything I've worked for. Dan stood up abruptly, his face a mixture of anger and hurt. This is insane, he said, his voice breaking. You separ my mother. How could you do this? Anne's shoulders slumped. For a moment I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered everything she'd tried to take from me. Everything she'd put me through. I couldn't feel sorry for her. Not after what she'd done. You don't truly understand, Anne muttered, her eyes wild. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I did what I had to do, for us, for the family. It's the only way to survive. No, Claire interjected, standing up from the table. It's not what you did was selfish. What you did was take advantage of Dad Sip's grief. That Sip's not surviving. That Sip's manipulation. Anne's eyes darted to Claire, and for a split second I saw something in her eyes. Something I hadn't noticed before. Fear. The realization that her whole plan was falling apart. And it was, all of it. The false seances, the fabricated documents, the manipulated grief. It was all exposed for what it was, a cold, calculated attempt to take what wasn't hers. The family was watching her now, their eyes filled with disbelief, their faces etched with confusion and betrayal. They couldn't look at her the same way again. She had ruined everything. Her lies had torn our family apart. I turned my gaze back to Anne, who was now shaking, trying desperately to regain control. But it was too late. The truth had already been laid bare, and she couldn't deny it. You're done, Anne, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I sep's done, it sep's over. She looked at me one last time, her expression a mix of defiance and desperation. Then, without another word, she turned and fled the house. The door slammed behind her, and the sound echoed in the silence of the room. For a moment no one spoke. Everyone was still processing what had just happened. But then slowly, one by one, the family began to speak. I can believe this, Claire said, her voice shaking. I'm so sorry, Dad. I should have seen this sooner. I shook my head. You don't have to apologize. You were right. I didn't want to believe it, but now I know the truth. I looked at my son, Dan. He was silent, but his eyes were filled with regret. I never thought she could go that far, he whispered. None of us did, I said softly. But she did, and now it's over. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The truth had won. My legacy was secure, and Anne's lies, her manipulation, had been exposed for the world to see. And in that moment, as the family sat in stunned silence, I realized that this battle wasn't just about the will, the house, or the workshop. It was about something deeper. It was about reclaiming my life, about taking back what was mine, and about making sure no one could ever take advantage of me again. The house was quiet after Anne's departure, but the air was thick with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The shock of the revelation was still hanging in the room like a dense fog. The Thanksgiving dinner, which was supposed to be a gathering of family and gratitude, had turned into something else entirely, a battlefield, with truths exposed, allegiances tested, and hearts torn apart. As I stood there in the quiet aftermath, I realized that the real work was just beginning. Anne had been the catalyst, but the fallout was far from over. My family was now divided, the threads of trust frayed, and the damage had already been done. Dan, my son, hadn't said much after the confrontation. He was still processing everything, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for answers that weren't there. His voice had trembled when he confronted Anne, but now he was silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Dad, Claire said, breaking the silence as she walked over to me. Are you okay? I nodded slowly, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure how to feel. Anger, relief, sadness, they all swirled inside me, and I wasn't sure which one to focus on. That's all fine, I said, though it didn't feel true. We got the truth out there. That's what matters. Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Instead, she hugged me. A simple gesture, but one that carried more weight than any words could. She had stood by me through all of this, even when I couldn't see the truth for what it was. She was my rock, my steady hand in a storm. I knew you'd get her eventually, Claire whispered. The family was still sitting in stunned silence, unsure of what to do next. They had watched it all unfold. The confrontation, the recording, the exposure of Anne's lies, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. I turned to look at them. The family members who had been closest to Anne, my brother-in-law, Tom, my sister, and my son. Tom's face was lined with confusion and anger, while my sister's eyes were filled with disappointment. There were no words, not yet. "What now?" Tom asked, his voice hard. "What do we do with this? We can just ignore it." I knew what he meant. The family had been divided by Anne's lies, and now there was no going back. It wasn't just the money or the house that had been at stake. It was the trust between all of us. The trust that had been broken when Anne decided to use our grief as a weapon. "I'll file the fraud claims," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions bubbling inside. "I want us to let her get away with this, not after everything she said's done." Tom nodded, but his expression was strained. "You can just go after her like that, Alex. This is going to cause a ripple effect. There are people involved, people who didn't no." I felt the weight of his words. The family's involvement, the way they had been manipulated. Anne had dragged everyone into this, and now I had to figure out how to deal with the fallout. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the people who had been caught in the crossfire. "I'm not going to let her drag anyone else into this," I said firmly. "But I'm not backing down. She needs to face the consequences of what she did." The tension in the room grew heavier. Dan finally looked up, his face pale but determined. "I don't know what to say." She sits, my mother. "You don't owe her anything," I interrupted gently. "Not after what she did." Dan's face twisted with emotion, the weight of his loyalties pulling him in two directions. He wanted to believe in his mother, to defend her, but he knew deep down that she had betrayed us all. "Dad, I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to fix it, Dan," I said. "You just have to accept that she made her choices, and you need to decide where you stand with the truth." The room fell silent again, each of us processing the impact of what had happened. For me, it was clear that the journey ahead wouldn't be easy. I'd taken the first step, but the aftermath would be a long and difficult road. I could hear the faint sound of the door closing outside, a reminder that Anne was gone but not forgotten. She had left, but the consequences of her actions would remain. The legal battle, the family rift, and the shattered trust. All of it would take time to heal. But for the first time in months, I felt a sense of control. The battle for my legacy wasn't over, but I had taken back what was mine. I had exposed Anne's lies, and now it was time to rebuild, to heal the damage, to repair the bonds that had been broken. I looked at Claire, who stood beside me, her eyes full of understanding. She didn't need to say anything. She had been my strength through all of this, and I knew no matter what came next, she would be there. "Let's take it one step at a time," I said quietly, my voice filled with a resolve I hadn't felt in a long time. As the family began to leave, each one with their own thoughts, I stayed behind for a moment. The house was quiet once again, but it felt different now. It felt like the first step toward a new beginning, a beginning where I wouldn't be controlled by lies or manipulation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for it. It's hard to describe the feeling when you realize that justice is finally within reach, but for me it was a combination of exhaustion and relief. The legal battle was just beginning, but the groundwork had already been laid. Anne's deception had been exposed. The receipts, the forged documents, the tape, all of it was now in the hands of my lawyer. The days following the Thanksgiving confrontation were a blur. I spent hours with my lawyer combing through every detail of the case, preparing for what was to come. I knew Anne wasn't going to just give up. She would fight this every step of the way, using every trick in the book to protect herself. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not this time. On December 5th, the court hearing finally arrived. The courtroom was quiet. As I sat in the front row, my hands clenched tightly together. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the lies, the months of stress hung heavy in the air. But today I wasn't just a victim. Today I was a man seeking justice for the life I had built, the legacy I had fought for, and the family I had lost. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began, and Anne's lawyer immediately tried to dismiss the case, claiming that there was no real evidence of fraud. But my lawyer was ready. He presented the receipts, the bank records, the private investigator's findings. All of it painted a clear picture of Anne's manipulation. And then came the recording. As the tape played in the courtroom, I could feel the tension in the air. Everyone in the room heard Anne Sipp's voice, clear as day. "We need to push him harder. If he doesn't Sips change the will, he Sips will lose everything. The spirit one Sips forgive him." I saw Anne's face in the courtroom. Her eyes widened in horror, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. She had tried to manipulate me, tried to use my grief to get what she wanted, and now she was going to pay for it. The judge listened carefully as my lawyer laid out the case, citing the forged documents and the fraudulent charges Anne had attempted to impose on me. There was no denying the evidence. Anne's entire scheme had unraveled before the court, and she had no way of defending herself. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm. "In light of the evidence presented," he said, "the will is valid, the fraud claims are substantiated, and the defendant's sex actions will be reported for further investigation." I could feel a weight lift from my shoulders as the verdict was read. Anne had been caught. The will stood, and everything I had worked for was safe. But even in that moment of victory, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. The price of this victory had been high. The betrayal, the destruction of my family. It wasn't something that could be easily repaired. Anne didn't say a word as she stood to leave the courtroom. Her eyes avoided mine, but I knew she was seething with anger and defeat. The look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She had thought she could manipulate me, use my grief to her advantage, but in the end it was her own actions that had destroyed her. As I left the courtroom, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, but also sadness. The family I had once known, the family I had once trusted, was forever changed. My relationship with Dan, with Claire, with the rest of the family, would never be the same. The damage was done. But at least, I thought, as I walked out into the cold December air, at least the truth had been served, justice had been done. And as I made my way back to the workshop that evening, I couldn't help but think of Sarah. I stood there in the dim light of the shop, her photo still hanging on the wall. "We did it," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. We kept our word. It wasn't a victory I could fully celebrate. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges. But I had fought for what was right, and that, at least, was something to hold on to. The days after the court hearing were a quiet kind of relief. The weight of everything that had happened was still heavy on my shoulders, but there was a sense of peace, a small sense of closure. Anne had lost. She'd been exposed for who she truly was, a liar, a manipulator, willing to destroy everything in her path for the sake of greed. But despite the victory, there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in all of this. The house felt different now. It was no longer the place where Sarah and I had built our lives together. It wasn't the same. The echoes of Anne's betrayal still lingered in the air, and the damage she'd caused to the family couldn't be undone, no matter how much I wished it could. I spent a lot of time in the workshop in those days. It was the one place that still felt like home. The smell of grease and metal, the quiet hum of the machines. It was a comfort I didn't fully realize I'd lost until everything had been on the line. There was no celebration for me. There was no joy in seeing Anne's plan fall apart. Yes, I had protected my legacy, my home and my business, but the cost of it all had been far higher than I expected. The trust that had been broken, the family torn apart, the scars would remain long after the courtroom verdict was a distant memory. I hadn't spoken much to Dan since the hearing. He had been quiet, retreating into himself, clearly struggling with the reality of everything that had unfolded. I understood his pain. He was caught between his loyalty to his mother and the truth of what she had done. I couldn't blame him for the confusion and hurt he must have felt. He was just as much a victim of Anne's lies as anyone, but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. I needed to talk to him. I needed to make him see that this wasn't just about the money or the workshop. It was about what she had done to all of us, and that couldn't be ignored. That evening, I called him. Dan, we need to talk, I said when he picked up. My voice was steady, but inside I was nervous. I didn't know where to begin, how to repair what had been broken, but I had to try. I don't too know, Dad, he replied quietly. I'm still trying to process everything. I don't too know what to think anymore. I know, I said, but I need you to understand something. What happened wasn't set your fault. Anne made her choices, and now we have to deal with the consequences. But I'm still your father, and I still need you in my corner. There was silence on the other end for a long moment. When Dan finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. I just don't get it, he said. How could she do that? How could she betray us like that? I don't said I've all the answers, son, I replied, my heart heavy. But what I do know is that you can set control what other people do. You can only control how you respond. And you set still, my son. That hasn't such changed. We sat in silence for a while, both of us thinking. The call ended shortly after, but I felt a small weight lift off my chest. It wasn't a solution, but it was a step. I knew the road to healing wasn't going to be easy, but at least there was still a chance. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, legal follow-ups, and quiet moments at home. But in the midst of it all, there was a sense of finality. The legal battle had been won, Anne's lies exposed, and my legacy was secure. But there was no triumph, no celebratory cheers. There was just the slow, quiet process of rebuilding what had been lost. I spent more time with Claire. She had been my strength through all of this. Her unwavering support had kept me grounded when I was ready to collapse. And as we spent time together, I began to realize that while things had changed, there was still something I could hold on to. The family wasn't gone forever. The damage was deep, yes, but it wasn't irreparable. The final test would come later, when Dan was ready to talk again. But for now, I was content to focus on what I could control. My work, my family, the people who had stuck by me through everything. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would be hard. There would be challenges, there would be painful conversations, and there would be more lessons to learn. But for now, I was content to take it one step at a time. As I stood in the workshop, I looked up at Sarah's photo one last time. The grief was still there, lingering in the background, but I felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure. It had been a hard road, but I had come out the other side. I did it, Sarah, I whispered. I kept my promise. The days following the court case felt like a strange mix of silence and clarity. The hustle and bustle of the holidays had faded into a dull hum, but in the quiet of the house I could feel the weight of the past few months lingering in the air. The snow had begun to fall in early December, soft flakes drifting down outside the window, but inside, things still felt cold. I hadn't expected everything to be resolved overnight. The broken bonds, the hurt feelings, the aftermath of Anne's betrayal, they weren't going to heal just because the legal battle was over. But there was a kind of peace in knowing that I had fought for what was mine. The house, the workshop, and my legacy, everything I had worked so hard to build was still intact. But the real battle was always going to be in the family. The fallout from Anne's actions was still fresh, and there was no telling how long it would take to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Claire had been my constant throughout all of this. The one person who never doubted me, never questioned my resolve. She'd been there through every moment, offering her support when I was too lost in my grief to see clearly. She was the one who'd kept me grounded when I was ready to fall apart. And yet, I knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. My relationship with Dan was still uncertain. I couldn't push him into choosing sides, but I also knew that the time would come when we'd have to have a real conversation about everything that had happened. But for now, I was grateful for the small moments. The quiet dinners with Claire, the evenings spent in the workshop, working on old projects, finding a sense of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. The holidays weren't as festive as they once were, but there was something cathartic in the simplicity. One evening, as Christmas approached, I found myself sitting by the fire, staring at the flames as they flickered and danced. The house felt warmer tonight, filled with the light of the tree, the soft glow casting shadows on the walls. It wasn't the same as when Sarah had been here, but it wasn't completely empty either. Claire walked in, carrying a mug of hot cocoa, and sat beside me on the couch. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding. "I know things aren't set perfect, Dad," Claire said softly, breaking the silence. "But I think we are getting there. One step at a time." I looked at her and nodded. "I know, kiddo, we've got a long road ahead, but we shall get through it." She smiled. A soft, knowing smile. "Yeah, we will." I wasn't sure what the future held. I didn't know if things with Dan would ever go back to how they were before, or if the family would ever fully recover from what Anne had done. But I did know this: I had fought for what was right. I had protected the things that mattered most, and I had exposed the lies for what they were. As the fire crackled, I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of everything that had happened begin to lift just a little. The grief was still there. The wounds were still fresh, but for the first time in a long time I felt like I had control again. The next day, Claire and I went out to pick out a Christmas tree, and as we set it up in the living room, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It wasn't the same peace I had once known, but it was a peace I could live with. I knew the scars from Anne's betrayal would never fully heal. The damage she'd caused would always be there, lingering in the background, but I also knew that I was stronger now. I had faced the storm, and I had come through it. The road ahead would still be difficult, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had my family, my legacy, and my integrity. Those were the things that mattered most, and no one could take them from me. And so, as I stood in front of the tree, looking at the lights reflecting off the ornaments, I made a silent promise to myself. This was my second chance to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. For the first time in a long time, I was looking ahead, not back. The ghosts of the past no longer held me captive. It was time to live again. The days turned into weeks, and though the immediate chaos of Anne's betrayal had settled, there was still a lingering sense of unease in the air. I had done what I set out to do. I had exposed the truth, protected my legacy, and reclaimed my life. But even with all the pieces falling into place, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was left undone. It wasn't until early February that I got a call that would change everything. I had been spending more time in the workshop, trying to keep myself busy. The steady rhythm of work, the constant hum of tools and machines, kept my mind from drifting too far. I had taken Claire's advice to heart. One step at a time, rebuilding, healing, that's what mattered now. The phone rang just as I was tightening a bolt on the hood of an old Chevy. I didn't recognize the number, but something in my gut told me to answer it. "Hello?" I said, wiping my hands on my shirt before picking up the receiver. "Mr. Alex?" the voice on the other end asked. It was a voice I didn't recognize. A man's voice, professional but with a hint of familiarity. "Yes," I replied, a flicker of unease running through me. "My name is Richard Jameson. I'm the landlord for a property located on Ridgeway Street near downtown. I believe you might be familiar with the tenant." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That tenant is your daughter-in-law, Anne." I felt my chest tighten. "What about her?" "I'm afraid there's been a situation," he continued, his tone more serious now. "Anne's been late with her rent for the last 2 months. We've tried contacting her several times, but there's been no response. It's been escalating. She's behind on payments, and I've been forced to start eviction proceedings." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd known Anne had left after the fallout at Thanksgiving, but I hadn't heard anything since. The last time I'd seen her was when she stormed out of the house, humiliated and defeated. I hadn't expected to hear from her again, let alone hear about her living situation. "Wait," I said, trying to process the information. "Yes," Richard said, his voice steady. "She's been renting for the past few months. The payments have been irregular, and now she's out of touch completely. I'm calling to let you know in case you want to handle the matter directly. We're giving her until the end of the week to resolve the issue, or we'll have to proceed with eviction." I sat in stunned silence for a moment. Of course, Anne had moved into a new place. She had always been good at running away when things got tough. But what struck me was the irony of it all. The woman who had tried to manipulate me, who had lied and schemed to take everything from me, was now facing the consequences of her own actions. I let out a breath I didn't soused. You realize I was holding. I shall take care of it, I said, my voice hardening. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up the phone, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt a sense of justice. Anne had tried to destroy me, and now she was reaping what she had sown. But another part of me couldn't shake the thought that this was somehow too fitting. She had moved on, believing she could leave the wreckage of her lies behind. She had tried to start fresh, to rebuild her life on the foundation of deceit and manipulation. And now, just like her plan to take everything from me, it was falling apart. The next morning, I drove to the address Richard had given me, unsure of what I would find. When I arrived, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The windows were dark and the door was locked. I rang the bell, but no one answered. I knocked again, harder this time, but still, nothing. After a few moments of hesitation, I took a step back and looked up at the house. It was a modest two-story, nothing special, but there was something hauntingly familiar about it. Anne's new life was no different from the old one. It was just another facade, another place where she could hide behind her lies. I turned to leave, but then I saw it. Sitting on the porch, barely visible beneath the snow that had started to fall again, was a stack of mail. I walked over, my footsteps crunching in the snow, and picked up the letters. There were several of them, all addressed to Anne, bills, notices, and the final one that caught my eye, a final eviction notice dated just 2 days earlier. The irony of it all hit me again. She had left everything behind, her marriage, her family, her reputation, and now she was losing it all over again. The life she had built on manipulation and deceit was crumbling around her. I shoved the letters into my coat pocket and walked back to my car, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I had won my battle, but Anne was losing hers. And that, in a way, was the final piece of justice. She hadn't just lost the fight against me. She had lost herself in the process. As I drove away, I looked out at the falling snow, the quiet of the world outside mirroring the stillness in my heart. It was over. The game was done, and in the end, the truth had come full circle.